Danny Wright stepped off the transport ship and felt the hot desert wind hit his face like a slap from an angry giant. The red sand of Cathera Prime swirled around his boots as he walked down the metal ramp carrying his heavy tool bag and a rolled-up bundle of papers that contained his building plans. The alien world stretched out before him in all directions, showing nothing but rolling dunes and rocky outcrops under a pale orange sky that made everything look like it was covered in rust. The Zathari colony rose from the desert floor like a collection of giant glass sculptures that someone had dropped from space. Tall crystalline towers twisted up toward the clouds, catching the sunlight and throwing it back in rainbow patterns that danced across the sand. Energy shields shimmered in the air around the settlement, creating perfect domes of cool, clean atmosphere that kept the dust and heat away from the elegant buildings inside. Danny had seen pictures of Zathari architecture before, but being here in person made him feel like a caveman visiting a museum colony administrator. Veltar glided toward him on legs that moved like liquid mercury inside his environmental suit. The Zathari leader stood nearly 8 feet tall with skin that looked like polished blue stone and eyes that glowed with their own inner light. Behind him came Chief Engineer Kessahin, whose crystalline features reflected the colony's towers in miniature, making him look like he was made from the same materials as their buildings. Danny extended his hand in the human greeting gesture, but Veltar simply nodded his head in what Danny hoped was a sign of respect. The administrator spoke through a translation device that made his voice sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. He welcomed Danny to their world and expressed gratitude for the human assistance program that had brought him here to help with their expansion projects. Kessahin examined Danny with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance, from his sturdy work boots to his simple cotton shirt. The chief engineer asked polite questions about human construction methods and listened to Danny's answers with the kind of patience that adults show to children who are trying to explain something they don't really understand. Danny pulled out his building plans and spread them on a nearby transport container. The designs showed thick-walled structures made from local sandstone and metal plating with multiple backup systems and what looked like crude ventilation networks running through every room. The buildings had no elegant curves or glowing panels, just solid rectangular shapes with heavy doors and small windows, protected by metal shutters. Veltar and Kessahin studied the plans with expressions that Danny couldn't read on their alien faces, but their body language spoke volumes. They leaned away from the drawings slightly and exchanged quick glances that lasted just long enough for Danny to notice. The administrator asked careful questions about the wall thickness and why humans needed so many redundant systems when modern technology could provide perfect environmental control. Danny explained that human engineering focused on reliability over elegance because Earth had taught them that weather and natural disasters could destroy the most advanced systems if they weren't built to handle the worst possible conditions. He talked about hurricanes and earthquakes and ice storms that had shaped human building techniques over thousands of years, making them conservative and cautious in their approach to construction. Kessahin responded by showing Danny the specifications for Zathari architecture on a glowing holographic display. Their buildings used advanced materials that could flex and adapt to environmental stress while maintaining perfect structural integrity. Energy shields provided climate control and protection from particle bombardment, while self-repair systems fixed any damage automatically without human intervention. The chief engineer explained that Zathari civilization had moved beyond primitive building methods long ago and now relied on sophisticated technology to create living spaces that were both beautiful and functional. Their crystalline towers weren't just homes and workplaces, but works of art that enhanced the lives of everyone who lived in them. Danny nodded and said he understood their approach, but suggested that having backup systems might still be useful in case of unexpected problems. He offered to build additional shelter structures using human methods that could serve as emergency refuges or storage facilities for the growing colony population. Veltar considered this proposal for several minutes while the desert wind whistled through the gaps between buildings. Finally, he agreed that colony regulations required them to accept assistance from their human partners and that Danny should be allowed to demonstrate his construction techniques. However, he suggested that human methods might be more suitable for less critical applications than their main residential and industrial facilities. The administrator assigned Danny a small section on the colony's outer edge where he could build his shelter without interfering with Zathari operations. The location sat beyond the main energy shields in an area that the colonists considered unsuitable for permanent habitation due to its exposure to dust storms and temperature fluctuations. Danny thanked them for the opportunity and began unloading his equipment from the transport ship. His tools looked primitive compared to Zathari construction devices, but they were built to work in any environment without requiring complex power systems or delicate calibration procedures. Over the following days, Danny started construction on his shelter complex while Zathari workers watched with barely concealed amusement. They helped him move heavy stones and install metal plating, but their assistance came with the kind of tolerance that experienced craftsmen show to apprentices, who insist on doing things the hard way. The other colonists occasionally visited the construction site to observe human building techniques firsthand. They commented on the thickness of the walls and the redundancy of the systems, with the sort of polite interest that people show when watching historical demonstrations at museums. Danny worked steadily through the heat of the day and the chill of the desert nights, building his shelter one stone at a time. The structure grew slowly into a squat rectangular building that looked like a fortress compared to the graceful Zathari towers that surrounded it. As the walls rose higher, Danny installed multiple layers of protection, including metal shutters over the windows and heavy blast doors at the entrances. He built separate ventilation systems with manual controls and backup power supplies that could operate independently of the colony's main grid. The Zathari assigned to help him followed his instructions carefully, but Danny could see in their movements and expressions that they considered the project an exercise in primitive engineering, rather than serious construction work. They were professionals doing their jobs, but their hearts weren't in building something they saw as a step backward from their advanced civilization. When colony residents asked Danny about his progress, he explained that the shelter was designed to withstand extreme weather conditions and provide reliable protection, even if all other systems failed. His answers were met with polite nods and the kind of smiles that suggested his concerns were appreciated, but unnecessary. The Zathari had been living on Cathara Prime for decades, and had their environment perfectly controlled through advanced technology and careful planning. They saw no reason to prepare for problems that their sophisticated systems could prevent from happening in the first place. 3 weeks passed as Danny hammered and welded and fitted stones together like pieces of an ancient puzzle, while the Zathari colony continued its daily operations around him. His shelter grew into a solid rectangular complex that housed basic living quarters and a workshop and storage areas, all built to withstand conditions that would destroy more delicate structures. The building had no elegant curves or artistic flourishes, just thick walls and heavy doors, and multiple layers of protection that seemed excessive to everyone who looked at it. The Zathari workers assigned to help Danny completed their tasks with professional efficiency, but Danny could see in their faces that they considered the project beneath their expertise. They were skilled engineers and technicians who normally worked with advanced materials and sophisticated systems, but here they found themselves moving rocks and installing crude metal plating like construction workers from a primitive civilization. Meanwhile, the main Zathari settlement continued expanding with new crystalline towers that rose gracefully from the desert floor, like flowers made of light and glass. Each building incorporated advanced materials that could self-repair and adapt to environmental changes, while energy shields created perfect climate-controlled environments that made the harsh desert feel like a comfortable indoor space. During the weekly colony meetings, Veltar and his staff reviewed progress reports and discussed future expansion plans in the main conference chamber, which was itself a work of art with walls that glowed softly and furniture that seemed to float in the air without visible support. The meetings were conducted in the musical Zathari language, but translation devices allowed Danny to follow most of the discussions. Chief Engineer Kessin presented the quarterly expansion report during one of these meetings, showing holographic displays of new construction projects and infrastructure improvements that would allow the colony to house twice as many residents within the next year. When he mentioned the human shelter project, several colonists made sounds that the translation device rendered as polite laughter. Scientist Thexara commented that the human building looked like something their ancestors might have constructed 1,000 cycles ago before they developed proper building techniques and advanced materials. Others noted how the thick walls blocked their communication systems, and how the manual controls seemed barbarically inefficient compared to automated systems that could adjust themselves instantly to changing conditions. colony meteorologist Nim Eth, added that the heavy construction was completely unnecessary on a world where weather patterns were perfectly understood and controlled through their shield technology. The energy barriers could deflect any storm or particle bombardment that Cathera Prime might produce, making elaborate physical protection redundant and wasteful. Danny attended these meetings but said little during the discussions about his project. He had been studying the planet's geological surveys and atmospheric data, using his own monitoring equipment, and the readings concerned him more each day. The planet showed signs of severe weather events that didn't match the Zathari climate models, but his attempts to discuss these findings were met with polite dismissal. The Zathari had been studying Cathera Prime for decades, using sensors and analysis, techniques far more advanced than anything humans possessed. Their data showed a stable desert world with predictable weather patterns that posed no threat to properly protected settlements. They saw Danny's concerns as the natural paranoia of a species that had evolved on a dangerous world and hadn't yet learned to trust in advanced technology. Lisa Murphy, the human geologist who had arrived with Danny, shared his worries about seismic readings that suggested massive atmospheric disturbances might be possible on this world. Her rock samples and soil analysis indicated that Cathera Prime had experienced violent weather events in its geological past, but the Zathari scientists considered her primitive testing methods inferior to their sophisticated sensor networks. Veltar privately told Danny that, while the colonists appreciated human enthusiasm and willingness to help, they should understand that the Zathari had been exploring and colonizing harsh worlds for centuries, without losing a single settlement to environmental factors. Their technology had been tested on dozens of planets and had never failed to provide adequate protection. The administrator explained that humans might feel more comfortable building thick walls and redundant systems because they came from a world where natural disasters were common and unpredictable. But the Zathari had evolved beyond such primitive concerns through the development of technology that could control and predict environmental factors with perfect accuracy. Danny listened to these explanations with growing frustration, but kept his opinions to himself while he continued working on his shelter. He installed additional backup systems and reinforced the walls even further, while the Zathari workers helped him with expressions that suggested they were humoring an eccentric guest rather than building something important. The other colonists occasionally visited the construction site to watch human building techniques, with the kind of curious interest that people show when observing historical demonstrations. They asked polite questions about why humans use such heavy materials and crude methods when lightweight alternatives and automated systems were available. Danny explained that human engineering prioritized reliability over efficiency because experience had taught them that the most elegant solutions often failed when conditions became extreme. He talked about the importance of having systems that could operate independently, without requiring complex maintenance or perfect environmental conditions. His explanations were received with the kind of patient attention that teachers give to students who are struggling with difficult concepts. The Zathari understood what Danny was saying, but they clearly felt that human concerns were based on outdated thinking that hadn't adapted to the realities of advanced technology. Thexara visited the shelter one afternoon and walked through the completed sections, examining the thick walls and manual control systems with scientific curiosity. She asked detailed questions about human construction methods and listened to Danny's answers with genuine interest. But her final comment revealed her true opinion of the project. She told Danny that while human ingenuity was admirable in its own way, the shelter represented a step backward from the progress that intelligent species should be making toward better living through technology. Building thick walls to keep out weather was like hiding in caves when one could live in palaces that controlled their own environment. The scientist explained that Zathari philosophy emphasized harmony between intelligent life and advanced technology, creating living spaces that enhanced rather than merely protected their inhabitants. Their buildings weren't just shelters but integrated systems that provided perfect comfort and beauty, while requiring minimal resources and maintenance. Danny nodded and thanked her for the explanation, but continued working on his project with the same careful attention to detail that he had shown from the beginning. He knew that the Zathari considered his methods primitive and wasteful, but something in the planetary data continued to worry him, despite their assurances about their environmental control systems. As his shelter neared completion, Danny found himself hoping that he was wrong about the atmospheric readings and that the Zathari scientists were right about their ability to predict and control the weather on their adopted world. The alternative was too frightening to contemplate, but his human instincts told him to prepare for the worst possible scenario, regardless of what the sophisticated computer models predicted. 6 weeks after Danny's arrival on Cathera Prime, the planet's weather monitoring systems detected an unusual atmospheric formation developing in the northern hemisphere, like a giant spiral of angry clouds that stretched across thousands of kilometers. The Zathari meteorologists, led by weather coordinator Nemeth, studied the readings with mild interest and classified the disturbance as a standard seasonal event that occurred every few years when temperature differentials created larger than normal wind patterns. Nemeth presented his analysis during the morning briefing, explaining that their computer models predicted a minor dust storm that would reach the colony in approximately 48 hours, with wind speeds of perhaps 100 kilometers per hour, and particle density well within acceptable parameters for their shield systems. He recommended standard preparations, including securing loose equipment and reducing non-essential activities until the weather passed. Danny sat in the back of the briefing room, listening to the translation with growing alarm, because his own monitoring equipment showed readings that painted a completely different picture of the approaching storm. The crude instruments he had built from spare parts and basic components were designed for reliability rather than sophistication, but they were giving him atmospheric pressure readings that made his stomach clench with fear. His barometric sensors showed pressure drops far more severe than anything in the Zathari records, and the electromagnetic interference patterns suggested a storm of unprecedented magnitude that could generate sustained winds exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. The particle density readings indicated that sand and debris would be moving at velocities that could damage even advanced materials through constant bombardment. Danny raised his hand and requested permission to present additional data about the storm, but several colonists exchanged glances that suggested they considered his interruption inappropriate during a scientific briefing. Nemeth graciously allowed Danny to speak, but his tone carried the patience that experts show to amateurs who think they understand complex subjects. Danny stood up and pulled out his handwritten charts and basic calculations showing the atmospheric pressure changes and wind speed projections that his equipment had recorded over the past 24 hours. He explained that the storm appeared to be much larger and more powerful than the Zathari models predicted, and could pose serious dangers to the colony's infrastructure. The meteorologist examined Danny's data with polite interest but pointed out that human monitoring equipment lacked the sensitivity and accuracy of Zathari sensors that could detect atmospheric changes at the molecular level. He suggested that the discrepancy between their readings might be due to calibration errors or interference from local electromagnetic fields. Chief Engineer Kessin stood up and activated a holographic display showing the colony's shield specifications and structural integrity ratings for all major buildings. The energy barriers could deflect particle streams moving at any velocity that nature could produce, while automatically adjusting their frequency and intensity to match changing conditions. The crystalline towers were designed to flex with wind forces while maintaining perfect structural stability. The chief engineer explained that Zathari buildings had weathered storms on dozens of worlds, including planets with atmospheric conditions far more extreme than anything Cathera Prime could generate. Their materials could withstand temperature changes that would shatter primitive construction, while their automated systems could compensate for any environmental stress that might occur. Danny listened to these reassurances, but felt compelled to make one final attempt to convince the colonists that they might be facing something beyond their experience. He stood up again and asked for permission to present his concerns about the storm's potential impact on their systems, even if the probability of serious problems was very low. Veltar nodded his permission, with the graciousness that good leaders show to subordinates who want to be heard even when their concerns seem unfounded. Danny walked to the front of the room and began explaining his analysis, using simple terms and basic physics that anyone could understand, regardless of their technological background. He pointed out that the atmospheric pressure readings suggested wind speeds that could create harmonic vibrations in tall structures, especially those made from crystalline materials that might resonate at specific frequencies. The particle bombardment could overwhelm filtration systems and cause power drains that might affect the energy shields at precisely the moment when maximum protection was needed. Danny suggested that the colonists should at minimum have backup plans in case their systems encountered unexpected difficulties during the storm. He offered his shelter as an emergency refuge, noting that it had been designed specifically to handle extreme weather conditions without relying on external power or sophisticated control systems. The suggestion was met with silence that stretched uncomfortably long while the colonists considered the implications of what Danny was proposing. The idea that advanced Zathari civilization might need to retreat to a primitive human structure seemed almost insulting to people who had spent their entire lives surrounded by technology that made their environment perfectly controllable. Scientist Thexara broke the silence by commenting that hiding in Danny's shelter would be like abandoning civilization itself and returning to the caves where their ancestors had cowered from natural forces before developing the technology to master their environment. She suggested that accepting such primitive solutions would represent a failure of intelligence and engineering that no advanced species should contemplate. Other colonists murmured agreement with her assessment while looking at Danny with expressions that mixed sympathy with embarrassment at having to listen to suggestions that seemed to question the fundamental principles of their technological society. They appreciated his concern but felt that his fears were based on human experience with primitive conditions, rather than understanding of advanced systems. Kessin concluded the discussion by thanking Danny for his input and explaining that the colony's engineers had considered every possible contingency during their planning phase, including storm conditions far more severe than anything their sensors had ever detected on this world. Their systems had multiple redundancies and backup protocols that could handle any emergency that might arise. Veltar dismissed the meeting with instructions for all departments to implement standard storm preparations, including the securing of loose equipment and the adjustment of shield frequencies to optimize particle deflection. He expressed confidence that the colony would weather this minor atmospheric disturbance as easily as they had handled dozens of similar events in the past. Danny gathered his papers and left the briefing room feeling like a man who had tried to warn people about a flood while they insisted that their dam was strong enough to hold back any amount of water. He returned to his shelter and began making final preparations for conditions that he hoped would never come, but feared were approaching faster than anyone else realized. The Zathari continued their normal activities with the calm confidence of people who had never experienced the failure of their technology, while Danny worked through the night checking and rechecking his backup systems and emergency supplies, hoping desperately that he was wrong about what the storm would bring to their world. The storm arrived 18 hours ahead of Zathari predictions, moving across the desert like a wall of angry darkness that stretched from horizon to horizon and rose so high into the atmosphere that its top disappeared into the orange sky of Cathara Prime. What had begun as routine weather monitoring in the colony's control center quickly escalated into crisis management, as the atmospheric disturbance proved far more powerful and destructive than anyone had imagined possible. The first sign of trouble came when the outer perimeter shields began fluctuating like candle flames in a strong wind, as massive volumes of sand and debris struck the energy barriers with forces that exceeded their design specifications. The automated systems responded by increasing power flow to the shield generators, but the constant bombardment of particles moving at incredible velocities created an energy drain that steadily depleted the colony's power reserves. Weather Coordinator Namath watched his instruments with growing alarm as wind speed readings climbed past 200 kilometers per hour and continued rising toward velocities that his equipment had never been designed to measure. The particle density monitors showed levels of atmospheric debris that should have been impossible under normal weather conditions, but the storm seemed determined to ignore every scientific prediction about what was supposed to happen on this world. In the colony control center, Administrator Veltar and his staff monitored their sophisticated systems as warning lights began appearing on control panels throughout the facility like red flowers blooming in a garden of technology. Communication arrays started going offline as sand infiltrated their delicate components, while climate control systems overloaded, trying to maintain pressure differentials against the storm's incredible fury. Chief Engineer Kessahin realized with growing horror that their energy shields were failing under the relentless assault of wind and debris that hammered against the barriers with the persistence of ocean waves against a crumbling seawall. The shield generators were running at maximum output, but the power consumption was rising faster than their backup systems could compensate, creating a cascading failure that threatened to leave the entire colony exposed. The elegant Zathari buildings, faced their greatest test as harmonic vibrations from the howling winds began resonating through the crystalline frameworks of their towers, like tuning forks struck by invisible hammers. The beautiful structures that had seemed so graceful and artistic now revealed themselves as vulnerable to forces that their designers had never anticipated. Encountering, self-repair systems worked frantically to compensate for stress fractures that appeared in the crystalline walls, but the damage accumulated faster than the automated systems could fix it, creating a race between destruction and recovery that the buildings were slowly losing. The advanced materials that could adapt to normal environmental stress proved inadequate against the sustained fury of a storm that seemed determined to test every assumption about what nature could produce. Emergency power systems activated throughout the colony as the main generators struggled to meet the energy demands of shields and climate control and structural support systems, all operating at maximum capacity simultaneously. Backup batteries that were designed to last for days during normal emergencies began draining in hours as the storm consumed power faster than anyone had thought possible. Several of the tallest crystalline towers began swaying visibly as the wind found resonant frequencies that amplified the forces acting on their structures, turning elegant architectural features into sources of dangerous instability. Engineer crews rushed to implement emergency bracing procedures, but the towers continued to flex and bend under loads that exceeded their engineering specifications. In the communications center, technicians watched helplessly as their advanced sensor networks failed one by one, leaving them increasingly blind to conditions outside the colony, as the storm destroyed the delicate equipment that had provided perfect environmental awareness for decades. The sophisticated early warning systems that should have predicted this disaster had been among the first casualties of the very storm they had failed to detect. Scientist Thexara worked desperately in her laboratory trying to understand how their computer models could have been so completely wrong about the storm's intensity and duration. While around her the buildings shuddered under impacts that made her scientific instruments dance across their tables like nervous animals, her research into atmospheric dynamics suddenly seemed inadequate when faced with a weather system that refused to follow the rules. The colony's medical center prepared for casualties as reports came in of injuries from falling debris and structural failures throughout the settlement, while Chief Medical Officer Zixon struggled to maintain life support systems in a building that was never designed to handle the kind of punishment it was receiving from the storm as the outer shields collapsed. In sections, the full force of the storm struck unprotected buildings with devastating results. Windows shattered under the impact of sand moving at bullet velocities, while air filtration systems clogged and failed, leaving many structures with increasingly toxic atmospheres as dust and debris penetrated their supposedly sealed environments. Veltar faced the hardest decision of his career as he watched decades of careful planning and advanced engineering crumble under the assault of natural forces that their civilization had thought it could control. The colony that had been his pride, and the symbol of Zathari technological superiority, was being systematically destroyed by weather that their best scientists had dismissed as a minor inconvenience. Over the failing communication system, the administrator issued an order that felt like admitting defeat for his entire species. He commanded all personnel to evacuate their positions and seek emergency shelter in the human structure that they had dismissed as primitive and unnecessary. The words came out like stones from his throat as he acknowledged that their advanced technology had failed when they needed it most. Through the chaos and fury of the storm, colonists struggled across the settlement toward Danny's shelter, fighting against winds that threatened to lift them from their feet and hurl them across the desert like tumbleweeds. The journey that should have taken minutes stretched into an epic battle against nature as people who had lived their entire lives in perfect comfort discovered what it meant to fight for survival. The human shelter stood solid and unmovable in the storm like a mountain that had decided to ignore the weather while everything around it bent and broke and failed. The thick walls that had seemed so crude and excessive now revealed their purpose as they absorbed impacts that would have shattered more elegant construction, while the heavy doors remained sealed against wind pressures that buckled sophisticated barriers. Danny stood at the shelter entrance helping colonists inside as they arrived battered and terrified from their journey through the storm. His building, that had been the subject of polite mockery for weeks, now represented the only safe haven on a world where advanced technology had proven inadequate against the raw power of nature unleashed. Danny's shelter proved to be exactly what the desperate situation demanded as 200 Zathari colonists crowded into the main spaces and discovered something they had never experienced before on Cathara Prime, which was complete protection from an environment that their advanced technology could not control. The thick walls blocked the howling wind so completely that the terrifying sounds of destruction outside became muffled background noise, while the multiple redundant systems continued functioning even as sand infiltrated and destroyed every other structure in the colony. The crude ventilation system that the Zathari had dismissed as primitive technology now filtered the air with perfect efficiency, using simple mechanical principles that required no computer control or delicate calibration. Procedures. The heavy construction that had seemed so unnecessary damped the storm's vibrations to manageable levels, while manual controls allowed continued operation. When automated systems throughout the colony failed one after another, Administrator Veltar found himself standing in a rectangular room with plain metal walls and basic lighting that provided more genuine safety than all the elegant crystalline towers that had been his pride for decades. The human shelter felt cramped and crude compared to Zathari architecture, but it offered something that their sophisticated buildings could not deliver, which was absolute certainty that the walls would not collapse no matter what nature threw. Against them, Danny and geologist Lisa Murphy worked alongside Zathari engineers to organize the refugees and coordinate rescue efforts for colonists still trapped in damaged buildings throughout the settlement. The shelter's workshop became an emergency command center where they used simple radio equipment to maintain contact with rescue teams, while the colony's advanced communication networks lay in ruins. Chief Engineer Kessin assisted with the evacuation, coordination while studying the human construction methods that had saved his people from a disaster that their own engineering had failed to prevent. He examined the thick walls and redundant systems with new understanding, seeing not primitive workmanship, but sophisticated design, optimized for reliability over elegance. The shelter's storage areas provided emergency supplies, including food and water and medical equipment that Danny had stockpiled during construction, while the living quarters offered genuine comfort, despite their simple appearance. Sleeping areas with basic furniture accommodated families, while communal spaces allowed people to gather and support each other during the crisis. For 3 days, the storm raged across Cathara Prime with a fury that exceeded every prediction and computer model that Zathari science had produced. Outside the human shelter, the beautiful colony suffered devastating damage as crystalline towers collapsed under sustained wind loads that their designers had never imagined possible, while energy systems failed and left the remaining structures completely exposed to the storm's assault. Weather coordinator Nemeth worked with Danny to monitor atmospheric conditions using the humans' simple but reliable instruments that continued functioning when sophisticated Zathari sensors had been destroyed by the very storm they were supposed to measure. The crude barometric equipment and manual wind gauges provided vital information about the hurricane that their advanced weather station could no longer deliver. Scientist Thexera found herself helping to operate emergency systems that used mechanical controls instead of computer interfaces, discovering that manual operation required skills and understanding that her technological education had never provided. She learned to read analog gauges and adjust ventilation manually, while gaining new respect for engineering approaches that prioritized human control over automated convenience. The shelter's emergency power systems ran on simple fuel cells that required no complex maintenance or perfect environmental conditions to operate effectively. The backup generators continued providing electricity throughout the storm, while the colony's main power grid failed under loads that its sophisticated management systems could not handle. During quiet moments between rescue operations, Veltar found Danny in the workshop manually adjusting air circulation controls while monitoring atmospheric pressure on analog gauges that gave readings as accurate as any computer system. The administrator watched silently as the human engineer demonstrated the wisdom of preparing for the worst possible conditions rather than assuming that technology could control every variable. The colony's medical staff treated injuries and maintained life support for vulnerable patients using equipment that operated independently of the main colony infrastructure. Chief Medical Officer Zixon discovered that the human shelter's simple but robust systems provided more reliable support for critical medical procedures than the elegant automated facilities that had failed when the storm damaged their control networks. As the hours passed, the Zathari began to understand that what they had mistaken for primitive construction was actually sophisticated engineering that approached the problem of environmental protection from a completely different philosophical direction. Where their technology sought to control nature through energy and computation, the human approach accepted nature's power and built structures strong enough to withstand whatever forces might be encountered. Children who had never experienced weather beyond the perfect climate control of Zathari buildings discovered what it meant to hear wind and feel the building respond to external forces while remaining absolutely safe. The shelter's solid construction provided security that allowed families to stay together during the crisis, while their normal homes lay damaged or destroyed. Lisa Murphy shared her geological research with Zathari scientists, showing evidence that Cathera Prime had experienced similar megastorms throughout its history, but at intervals too long for their relatively brief colonization period to have detected. Her primitive rock analysis and soil studies revealed patterns that their sophisticated sensors had missed because they were looking for the wrong indicators. When the storm finally passed on the third day, the colonists emerged from the human shelter to survey damage that shocked even those who had watched their systems fail in real time. The main settlement lay in ruins with only the most heavily reinforced structures still standing, while debris from destroyed buildings littered the landscape for kilometers in every direction. The beautiful crystalline towers that had defined Zathari civilization on this world were gone, leaving only twisted metal frameworks and scattered fragments of advanced materials that had proven inadequate against nature's assault. Decades of careful construction and artistic achievement had been erased in 3 days by weather that their science had declared impossible. But Danny's shelter remained completely intact, without even minor damage to its thick walls or redundant systems. The building that had been dismissed as crude and excessive stood as proof that different approaches to engineering could produce different results when tested by extreme conditions. As recovery efforts began, the Zathari approached reconstruction with new understanding and genuine humility about the limitations of their technological philosophy. They requested detailed plans for human shelter designs and asked Danny to oversee construction of additional emergency refuges throughout the colony. Sitkesin formally acknowledged that human engineering principles offered valuable lessons for advanced civilizations and that redundancy and reliability deserved equal consideration with efficiency and elegance in structural design. The chief engineer admitted that their focus on sophisticated solutions had created vulnerabilities that simpler approaches might have avoided. Thexera approached Danny with genuine curiosity about human building techniques, no longer viewing them as primitive relics but as differently evolved solutions to universal challenges that all intelligent species faced when trying to create safe living spaces in hostile environments. She requested permission to study human engineering methods for possible integration with Zathari technology. Veltar formally acknowledged Danny's contribution to the colony's survival during a ceremony held in the workshop of the human shelter that had saved every life in the settlement. The administrator noted that advanced technology meant nothing if it failed when needed most, and that sometimes the simplest solutions proved the most reliable when tested by forces beyond normal experience. Danny accepted the recognition quietly, and noted that different species developed different strengths based on their experiences, and that humans had learned to build for survival on a dangerous world, while the Zathari had developed incredible technological sophistication. The storm had taught everyone that wisdom came from combining different approaches rather than dismissing them as inferior. The final phase of reconstruction began with new shelters throughout the colony that blended Zathari aesthetic beauty with human engineering durability, ensuring that future storms would find the colonists prepared with the best solutions that both civilizations could provide working together.